Hey, I'm going to try a new video series here where I'm going to share with you a photo or photos that I took, and then I'm going to go full masked magician on it. Just reveal every last thing I can about how I took the photo, from camera equipment and technique to composition and light. And the first photo is coming off the press right now. She's a beaut, Clark. A beaut. This is a vacant Sears department store built in 1964 in Riverside, California. And this building is a beautiful specimen of mid-century modern architecture. And it's the perfect picture to start this series because it was a particularly dynamic sunset. It was changing a lot minute to minute. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of the light. So with this image, I am proud to introduce my new series called Dissecting a Photo. Let's dap it up, baby. So we're actually going to look at 5 versions of this photo because I took a lot of pictures that night on account of how much the light was changing. And we're going to dive deep into the light, but first let's talk about the technical aspects of the camera and composition. So I shot 3 rolls of film that evening, which is a little more than usual for me. 2 rolls of Kodak Portra 160, and then I switched to Portra 400 at the end of the night because the shutter speeds were getting so long, I was a little worried about getting motion blur in the palm tree fronds as they moved in the breeze. Now I shot everything on my Shenhao TFC 617A panoramic camera with my Rodenstock 115mm and a center ND filter to help even out the natural vignette of this moderately wide angle lens. I used lens rise on this shot to get the building a little bit lower in the composition. This is preferable to pointing the camera up a little bit because it keeps the vertical lines vertical. And I actually tweaked the rise partway through the shoot. The first 2 pictures here you'll see have slightly more foreground than the latter 3 pictures. And that's because as the sunset light started to flare up and the clouds were so gorgeous, I felt the need to include a little bit more sky. I also used a really hard shift on the lens to the left. And I want to explain why I did that. So I obviously wanted to do a straight on of this building, meaning I wanted all the horizontal lines to be parallel left to right throughout the entire composition and parallel with the top and bottom of the frame. A perfect straight-on composition. Now, the only way you can do that is by making the film plane of your camera parallel with the plane of the building. So in other words, you have to be lined up perfectly so that everything is parallel. And that keeps the lines horizontal and parallel left to right in the frame. Now, if your camera or your lens does not have a shift capability, that means there's only one place you can stand when you frame up your composition, and that is smack dab in the middle of the composition. So here it would mean I have to stand right here. Because that's halfway between the far right and the far left of my desired composition. But I didn't want to stand there. I wanted to be centered with what I consider the face of the building here, the main entrance. This big architectural feature with the Sears logo and all the interesting texture on the front, I wanted to be centered with that, so it feels like you're staring right into the face of the building. You're right at the entrance. But if I did that, it would have clipped the garages on the left and would have included far too much extra space on the right. So this is where the shift comes in to save the day. It allows me to have my cake and eat it too. I can stand where I want, but get my composition where I want, simply by shifting the lens back and forth to get the building centered how I want it to look. I use shift a lot in my architectural photography, particularly when I'm doing straight-ons like this, because it allows me to get the perspective, the vanishing point lines, going where I want, but include other parts of the scene that may not be there otherwise. So I love using shift and rise. It allows me to just put the building exactly where I want it. I shot everything at f/32 or f/36, very narrow. And I did that not so much for the depth of field. I did that to ensure I got maximum sharpness and minimum light fall off on my image circle. Now this lens has a nice big image circle, but still with my wide negative and that hard shift, I'm getting pretty close to the edge of it. Now I could have used tilt on this picture to lay down my plane of focus and get my wedge depth of field so that I get my whole scene in focus. But I didn't bother with it because it just wasn't necessary. I'm going to be using f32 and f36. My depth of field is going to be huge anyway. No point in complicating the situation by implementing some tilt. So that's the technical aspects on the camera itself. I'm not going to go into exactly how I metered this scene because that would require you have a pretty thorough understanding of what my metering process is. And that on its own would require a pretty lengthy explanation that you might say it justifies an entire online course just on that. Link in the description. So I'm not going to go into details on how I metered it because it wouldn't really make sense to you unless you've done the course. But if you are doing the course, log on in because I just posted a video there, a short thing explaining exactly how I metered this scene. For anyone who does understand my metering process, it should make plenty of sense. And that's a nice little bonus for anyone who's on my metering course. So that's all the technical aspects. I lucked out with no cars or hobos in the scene. There was a security guard there that obviously sweeps out the riffraff if they show up, and evidently didn't see me as riffraff. So that felt good because he didn't bother me at all. I kind of had the whole property to myself all evening. It was lovely. So let's talk about the light. I took these pictures on January 13th, 2024, so in winter, and that was far better than taking these pictures in the summer because this building is southward facing. I'm in the northern hemisphere. In the winter, it gets sunlight on it from sunrise to sunset. But in the summer, the sun rises and sets behind the building. So I wouldn't be able to get these late afternoon golden hour pictures with light actually hitting the building. So winter was the perfect time. Sunset was at 5:04 p.m. So that was also nice because I was able to take these pictures without missing dinner. Always love that. And of course we had incredible cloud cover resulting in lots of color. Now, the way cloud cover impacts a sunset is actually quite fascinating when you start breaking it down. So I want to take this opportunity to give a thorough anatomy of a sunset. This is going to feel a little like a science YouTube channel for a second here, but bear with me. I think you'll find it interesting. I got some visual aids to help here as well. But I'm also going to be referencing this book, Color and Light in Nature. It's no longer in print, but if you can get your hands on a used one, I strongly recommend it. It is so fascinating. It's one of my favorite books. It is just chock-a-block full of interesting explanations on atmospheric phenomenon, sunlight, shadow, refraction, all sorts of interesting stuff that us photographers tend to be kind of interested in. And the authors in this talk a fair bit about sunsets and twilight and why we get the colors we do at those times of day. So, going to these visual aids. Here's Earth. Here's the Sears building. Obviously, we're not to scale here, but try not to be intimidated by the incredible high-tech graphics. And let's say we go out to shoot this building at high noon. So the sun is directly overhead, and you may know that the sun gives off white light. And you may also know that white light from the sun is actually composed of an entire spectrum of color. This is why the sun can create rainbows in the rain. And you probably also know that we have an atmosphere around our planet, a nice envelope of air that makes life possible. And as we go through the explanations here, it's important to realize that the air in our atmosphere is not empty. It is an absolute murky mess of water vapor, water droplets, pollen, dust, smog, pollutants, insects even. There's particles all through the air, and those particles impact the light and how it looks to us. So if we go to take a picture at high noon like this, the sun is passing through not that much atmosphere because it's coming from directly overhead. And so the light comes through to us pretty much unmolested. It doesn't shift to any weird color. The molecules in the air, the particles in the air are not numerous enough to affect the light. But as we get towards sunset and the sun gets lower in the sky, the light passes through more atmosphere now because it's coming in at an angle. And as that light passes through the atmosphere and interacts with all those particles in the air, the light starts to change a little bit. And certain wavelengths of light get scattered out. And going to our book here, the shorter the wavelength, or bluer the light is, the greater its chances are of being scattered. For example, blue light is 3.2 times more likely to be scattered than red light. So the blue light gets scattered first, gets scattered much more easily than the warmer end of the color spectrum, the oranges and reds. And so as we get towards sunset and the light is passing through more atmosphere, the following happens. With a large fraction of its shorter wavelengths missing, the sun appears yellowish. In addition to scattering light, water vapor and ozone absorb heavily in the blue and green part of the spectrum, thereby further reddening the low sun. So as the sun passes through this much atmosphere, the blue light gets scattered out first, and water molecules as well as the ozone layer work to absorb more of that blue and green light, and all that's left is the warm tones, yellow, orange, red. And as the sun drops lower, it gets even more pronounced. It shifts even more into the orange and red end of the color spectrum. So that is why sunsets are an orangey red color. And if we look at our two photos here, the first two, you can see that the one that was taken slightly later is a little bit warmer. And that's because the sun was a little bit lower, passed through more atmosphere, and we got a shift towards the orange and red end of the color spectrum. Now, eventually, the sun is going to drop below the horizon completely. And when that happens, the light is not going to hit our building anymore, but it will be hitting the upper atmosphere, and it's going to be a very warm tone, very orange-red, because it's passing through a ton of atmosphere. But most of that light, if there's no clouds, will just escape out the other side of the atmosphere into space, never to be seen again, and of no use to us. Some of it will get reflected back down onto the landscape as it hits the particles in the air. Some of it will get bounced around into the air and still illuminate our scene. This is why when the sun has set and dropped below the horizon, it doesn't go to complete darkness right away. It's not like someone flips off the switch. The sunset lingers. It's still hitting all of the air in the atmosphere, and that actually illuminates a little bit. There's actually something called air light, which is kind of interesting. It's when the air itself kind of becomes its own light source from the light hitting it and scattering. So we may not be able to make use of any of that light that's going out the atmosphere. But even when there's no cloud cover, something interesting happens on the western edge of the horizon, at least at sunset. At sunrise, it would be in the east. Off into the west, you can no longer see the sun anymore because it's fully below the horizon, but you will see this big, brilliant, yellowish orange glow spanning the horizon. It can be huge, left to right, and up into the sky as well, but it's this glow, this lingering glow after the sun has set. That is called the twilight arch. There's an anti-twilight arch, that's opposite, and then there's the twilight arch, which is in the west at sunset, it's in the east at sunrise. And it's a huge glowing section of the sky where all of the air is still being illuminated by the sun that's below the horizon, and that twilight arch ends up becoming its own light source. And so it bathes its light on to your subject. This is why after the sun has set, you can sometimes still see side lighting on your subject. Let me show you a picture here that demonstrates this really well. So looking at this train car, you can see this is after sunset because there's no sunlight hitting the train car, and yet there's still light around, so light must be coming from somewhere. And that's because far off to the right, there is a huge twilight arch that formed right after the sun set, and the twilight arch is throwing its soft glow onto the landscape. Now, the twilight arch is huge. So, what kind of light do we get? Well, the bigger the light source is, the softer the light is, and the more feathered the shadows are. Same reason we use soft boxes in the studio. The bigger the light source gets, the softer the shadows get. So if you look at this picture, you can see the shadows are nearly non-existent. There's a little bit on the left side of these bushes and the left side of that little divot in the ground, and a little bit on the train car. You can tell that the light is coming from the right, but the shadows are so faint because that light source is so damn big. Now here is where it gets really interesting. So as the sun continues to drop below the horizon, that twilight arch will move with it. The twilight arch will go off into the distance. It gets dimmer and dimmer and further away. Now, as that twilight arch recedes away from you, what do you think happens to the light? How does the light change? And this is where, in my classes, when I would teach this, people's minds would be freaking blown. I don't believe you. It can't work that way, they'd say to me with great relish. Everybody thinks that the light would get softer. Well, it's getting dimmer, so the shadows are going to get even softer and the light is going to be even more flat because the light is fading away. But in fact, the opposite happens. As the twilight arch recedes into the distance, it's getting smaller. And the smaller it gets, the harsher the light looks. So the shadows harden up a bit, they get a little bit darker, contrast increases, and it starts to move away from that super diffused, super soft light. Let me show you an example to demonstrate this. So going back to this train car picture, look at how soft the light is. Now let me show you another picture taken that same evening, probably just 10 minutes later. The sun has dropped even further below the horizon, and we get this. Notice that the light actually looks more directional. If you look at the shadows on the bushes, you can see the one that was taken later actually has stronger shadows. That little divot right there, the shadow is more pronounced in the picture that was taken later. The shadow on the train car, more pronounced on the picture that was taken later. The sunlight hitting this side of the train car, more pronounced on the picture that was taken later. The light has gotten harsher because it got smaller. Now it did also get dimmer, but that doesn't really matter. Who cares? You just use a longer shutter speed, that takes care of it. We don't care that it gets dimmer. We care that it gets smaller, and that results in harsher light. So it's really interesting to watch on a sunset because you start off with this really harsh light with these very strong shadows. The sun drops below the horizon and then it's like instantly soft. Big giant softbox, shadows disappear. But then if you keep waiting, you wait around a little bit, it starts to come back towards harsh again, back towards directional, until it just fizzles out completely and it becomes nighttime. Now, that's all with no cloud cover. What happens if we got some cute little clouds overhead? Well, that's actually going to pick up the sunset light on its way out the atmosphere. Those are going to glow with that warm sunset light and then bounce it right back down onto the landscape. So you get this kind of fill light, lightening up the shadows further and adding some warm color to the subjects. You still get your twilight arch, so you still have light coming from the west at sunset or the east at sunrise. But we have this beautiful mixture of light. Now eventually the sun is going to drop so low that its light is just going to skate right past the clouds. Even they're not going to get illuminated by the sunset light. You'll still have a twilight arch, but it's going to be super small, way off in the distance, and everything's going to be very dim. And on top of that, the clouds are going to shift to a pretty deep blue tone. That's when you get into blue hour, and you're well past sunset, getting into those really deep blue tones. Now, on the topic of blue hour, there's another one of those things that I think is pretty effing fascinating. Have you ever wondered or thought about the fact that sunsets shift back to blue at the end? Which is kind of weird when you think about it. Because the whole reason a sunset is yellow and orange is because the blue wavelengths are getting filtered out. So it seems like as it continues to set, they're just going to get filtered out more and more and more and more until it's just fully red and then it switches to night. Why does it go back to blue for a minute? Well, our trusty book will shed some light on this, pun intended. The Earth's stratospheric ozone layer, about 12 kilometers up, absorbs strongly at longer wavelengths, thus filtering out the reds, oranges, and yellows. So, that late in the sunset, when we start getting into blue hour, The only thing getting any light anymore is the uppermost layers of the atmosphere, where we have a high concentration of ozone, which, as we just learned, strongly absorbs the warm tones of the light spectrum. Plus, the air is so thin that high up that it doesn't warm shift the sunlight like the particulate-filled air does at ground level. And so all we see is blue light. This is also why, by the way, throughout the entire sunset, the sky above you will always remain blue. It never turns to that orange, red, yellow color that you see on the horizon or that you see on your building. It's always blue above you, assuming there's no clouds up there to catch the light and make it look not blue. But that's because you're looking up at the ozone layer essentially, and that's always gonna be blue. So I don't know about you, but I find all this stuff fascinating. I know it's a bit of a lengthy explanation. All my future dissecting a photo series I don't think are gonna be this involved, but thought it might be fun today. So let's take a look at the photos a little bit closer. I want to start with the first two taken before the sun set. You'll notice this earlier one, the sky is a little bit darker. And that's because when the sun is a little bit higher up, it's illuminating the building, but it's not really hitting the clouds yet. Because those clouds are very high up and the sun is kind of just skating under them to get to the building. But then later on, when the sun gets lower, it's still hitting the building, but now a lot of the sunlight is hitting those clouds. And so they start to brighten up a little bit. And that's the first indications of that colorful sunset, is those clouds starting to light up. And of course, we looked at the light being a little bit warmer on this later one because as the sun is lower on the horizon, it passes through so much more atmosphere. Now moving on to the final three shots after the sun has set. And let's look at these individually. So this first one was very close after sunset. I don't remember exactly how long, but maybe five minutes, couple minutes. So the sun has barely dropped below the horizon. I have a massive twilight arch off to the left, and so I get massively soft light on the building. You can see the shadows are almost non-existent. They're there, but they're so feathered, they'd be easy to miss. The clouds are starting to pick up a little bit of that light, and we have that beautiful warm tone from the twilight arch. The clouds are bouncing a little bit of light down onto the landscape, which is helping to illuminate the parking lot, because otherwise that would kind of be in deeper shadow being so much lower. But we're getting this nice fill light coming from the clouds above. And it's not fully red yet. It's kind of the earlier stages of the sunset where we still have oranges and yellows, but mainly very, very, very soft light. Now the next picture, this was taken maybe, I don't know, 5 minutes, 7 minutes later than the last one. You can see the colors are shifting even more red, but mainly what you'll notice here is the light has gotten a little bit harsher. The shadows are a little bit stronger, they're slightly less feathered, there's a little more depth, and that's because the twilight arch off to the left has gone further off into the distance, which means it has gotten a lot smaller, and that smaller light source has given us a slightly harsher light. This, I think, is my favorite from the whole series. It's definitely my wife's favorite, but I think this one has real good vibes to it, real good color palette. And I like that twilight arch is giving me slightly harsher light. I think it gives more depth to the scene compared to the previous one. Now the last shot of the evening. Don't let this deceive you. This was actually taken much later than you might guess by looking at this. The whole scene looked darker to my eyes than it does on the picture here. And that's the beauty of long exposures, is you can make it look a little brighter than it does to your inferior eyes. But you'll notice a few things. First, the light is even harsher. So the shadows have gotten slightly stronger still, and there's a little bit more contrast and a little bit more depth to the scene. And that's because, again, that twilight arch getting smaller off into the distance. So I get my slightly harsher light. You can see the sky is shifting to that blue tone we get at blue hour. So the light hitting the ozone layer is starting to dominate the scene more. But you can see the building still has a nice warm glow on it, and that's because the twilight arch is still there, and the twilight arch is that warm tone. So we get this nice contrast between the warm tones of the building and the blue tones of the sky. This is my second favorite shot from the evening, I think. Sometimes my first, not quite sure. But this is the last photo I took because, again, it was much darker than it looks here, and no artificial lights turned on. With no tenant in the building, I think the building owner doesn't want to be paying a big electric bill every month to illuminate an empty parking lot. So the lights never turned on. But that was the final shot. So that's it, I think. Yeah. That was a lengthy one, guys. I hope you stuck with me. I hope you found it interesting. I'm going to be giving away these 5 prints to 5 lucky contributors. So anyone who contributes, let's say, $5 or more in the month of February 2024 is automatically entered for the chance to win one of these. I'll just pick 5 people at random, and shipping included. I'll also put 1 or 2 of these on my website, available as a limited edition print offering, in case anybody's interested. Link in the description. All right, so that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I plan on doing more of these dissecting a photo if I get a decent response, to see if you guys like it. But yeah, thanks for watching. See you guys next time. If you got something beneficial out of this video and want to buy me a beer to say thanks, check the link in the description.